This is the 4th year that I've run a quote-unquote neuroscience panel at the Skoll World Forum. You may ask why a neuroscience panel. This is a forum for social entrepreneurs. I think I asked Sally the same thing too, but we go way back. We've been friends for many years, and she convinced me that this audience really was interested in what we knew about the brain at many different levels, and not just about the brain, but about behavior. And behavior does come from the brain. I mean, I opened a session last year by saying that we possess one of the most amazing, beautiful, and spectacular pieces of technology known to man, and it's not your iPhone, it is your brain. And what I'm hoping we can do in this session is take you on a journey with these 4 wonderful scientists behind me on starting from literally the very, very basic level, genes and cells within your brain, all the way through to sort of the psychiatry, the psychology of, how do we think the mind. And there are people out there who will try and convince you that what does the brain have to do with the mind? That bewilders me on a daily basis when I hear that. I'm not sure where they thought the mind was coming from. But we are going to take you on a journey. This is an experiment. Typically, I roll out a few really cool, or maybe not so cool neuroscientists. They tell you cool things, and everybody goes away quite happy. We're doing things a little bit differently this time. What I really want to have happen is for you to understand and listen to some of the science, the anthropology, the history behind this sort of very intense and I think very interesting field of the study of aggression and where that leads us to. And what I want is for everybody in the room that actually practices in environments where you have to deal with this, either as a barrier to creating the solutions to problems that you're facing, or as just simply that's there and seemingly immovable. I want you to be able to come forward with what you observe, what you see, and talk to the scientists. I mean, they follow certain lines of inquiry, largely based on their interest, but equally based on the grant funding that they can get. But you may have things that you actually see out in your world that they would like to hear that can help shape their future inquiries. And I would love that to be the outcome of this panel and beyond this actual session. So just really briefly, we're going to run through. Each scientist is going to have about 12 to 15 minutes. They have been ordered to stay within that time frame. You will not be bored, I promise you. I will allow 1 or 2 questions in between each of the panelists, but I really will keep it to 1 or 2 because I'm trying to preserve the last 25 minutes so that you can all interact and ask the questions. I have a cheat sheet of discussions and discussion items that I am willing to use, but I'm hoping you basically take that need away from me because you'll have the more interesting things you want to talk about. What we're also doing that's different this time is that we've sort of brought out 2 sacrificial lambs, if you like, 2 wonderful social entrepreneurs who are sitting right here. I'm going to introduce everybody in a second. And they're going to briefly tell you about their world and why understanding aggression and the contagion of aggression is important to them. So without any further ado, one last thing. See, I knew I'd forget. There is a really wonderful gentleman at the back of the room. Turn around, take a look. Give him a big round of applause. He is going to scribe this entire session. I told you, this is an experiment. They have not done this at Skoll before outside of the sort of private convenings that they have. He, in real time, is going to scribe the conversation that the scientists, the social entrepreneurs, and all of you have on those big boards. They will then be put up in the garden marquee so you can look at them afterwards. If anybody would like actual copies of all of the scribed outputs of this session afterwards, they're going to be cleaned up and pictures will be taken. Please come to the front and leave your business cards, and we will send you the links to those scribed outputs so you can see that. If you have any burning questions after this, tomorrow at 11 a.m. in the Founders Room, all of the panelists have kindly agreed to be there with their little brown baggy lunches, and you can come talk to them and ask them any questions you want, within reason. So let me introduce the wonderful panel, and then I'm going to get out of their way and actually let them take care of the rest of this session. So I'm going to start over here with David Anderson, who is a spectacular neuroscientist at Caltech. I'm not going to go into all the bios. You have them in the books, and I don't want to waste time on that. John Matani, who's, again, spectacular primatologist at the University of Michigan. Brian Ferguson, wonderful anthropologist, historian, and many other things at Rutgers Newark. And Simon Wesley, who's at, I guess King's is the official, King's College.
No spectacular?
Well, we decided ahead of time, Simon's on the naughty stool. We can talk about that later. Some people just will not cooperate. And over here we have some, I'm sure many of you know Teddy Bleacher, who's spectacular. It humbles me to be, you're all spectacular. You're on the naughty stool. And Caroline, who is here also, who I'm sure most of you know. And before I turn it over to David to open up, I'm going to say thank you to the one person that without this person, none of this would be possible, because I'm completely incapable of organizing anything by myself, which is my wonderful program executive, Gary Wilson from the Gatsby Foundation. So I want to publicly acknowledge and thank him for all the hard work. It's not me, so please, he's spectacular. So without further ado, I'm going to ask David to get up and walk you through the basic neural circuitry of aggression. So this is where you get to see all the cool neuroscience stuff first. David.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you for organizing this, and thanks to Gary for all of his great organizational work, and thanks to all of you for stepping outside of your respective silos and boxes for coming to this talk. So aggression is a normal social behavior that is highly evolutionarily conserved. It's typically seen between pairs of conspecific males in competition over resources such as food, territory, or females. And aggression, of course, has an emotional component in humans as well. And in my laboratory, we're interested in studying the basic biological mechanisms by which this complicated social behavior is encoded in the brain. Now, in social species, as you'll hear from our next two speakers, including ants, chimps, and humans, there is also a group form of aggression, which again is part of the normal behavioral repertoire of those species. But as we're all aware, in humans, the uncontrolled spread of aggression and violence can have absolutely devastating consequences, such as in genocide. And while the relationship of this type of human behavior to the dyadic encounters that we study in my lab is not clear, our hope is that understanding the basic biological mechanisms that underlie evolutionarily conserved aspects of aggression will at least contribute to this larger global problem, which, as you'll hear later, has many complex dimensions. Now, the neuroscience of aggression has its origins in the Nobel Prize-winning work of the Swiss neuroscientist Walter Hess, who showed in the late 1920s that you could stimulate aggression in cats by passing current into specific regions of the cat's brain and turn a normally placid animal into a hissing, spitting creature with its ears laid back and its teeth bared. In addition to this so-called defensive rage, Hess also showed that you could elicit a slightly different form of aggression, namely predatory behavior, such as a cat will show in attacking a mouse by stimulating slightly different and nearby regions of the brain. Now, these groundbreaking studies suggested that aggression might be somehow localized in the brain. But the methods used by Hess were not sufficiently precise to pinpoint the exact site. And moreover, there were a lot of questions raised and disagreement about whether these regions were required for naturally occurring aggression or were just a consequence of somehow artificially stimulating the brain. Now, ensuing work over the last 70 years in both cats and in rats has shown that brain regions that are involved in attack behavior are located in a deep and evolutionarily ancient structure called the hypothalamus. However, the hypothalamus is itself complex and is comprised of a number of different substructures, which neuroanatomists call nuclei. Furthermore, within these nuclei, there are different classes of neurons which we can now recognize and pinpoint by their expression of specific genes. So the question now arises, are there specific populations of neurons that are involved in mediating aggressive behavior? And if so, which of these neurons are they? Now, this question is difficult to address in the animals that are used in traditional neuroscience research, such as cats and rats. In order to probe the function of the brain at this level of granularity, it's necessary to work in organisms that are amenable to genetic manipulation, such as mice or fruit flies. And in these so-called model organisms, it's possible to genetically identify specific populations of neurons by the genes they express, and then manipulate these cells either to activate them or to inhibit or kill them. And in this way, if we find that inhibiting a certain class of neurons leads to blocking a behavior, we can conclude that those neurons are necessary for the behavior. If we find that activating these neurons causes the behavior to appear, we can conclude that the neurons are sufficient for that behavior. So by doing these tests of necessity and sufficiency, we can establish causality between the activity of specific populations of neurons in the brain and specific behaviors. Now, this type of approach has been facilitated in recent years by the introduction of what for my field has been a disruptive new technology called optogenetics. And this is a technology that uses light to specifically activate particular cells in the brain. It's based on the discovery that certain microorganisms, including bacteria and single-celled algae, have proteins that are activated by light, and these proteins form channels in the membrane of a cell that lets electrically charged ions flow into the cell. And that flux of ions can cause the cell to become electrically excited. And it's been shown that if one genetically transplants the gene encoding those microbial opsins into a neuron, from a mammalian species, it is possible now to excite that neuron to fire in a specific temporal pattern using temporally controlled pulses of light of the specific wavelength. Furthermore, through the availability of technologies to genetically manipulate mice, it's possible to target the expression of these channel rhodopsin proteins to specific sites and specific neurons within the hypothalamus. We do that by using an inactive virus as sort of a disposable molecular syringe to inject the DNA encoding the channel rhodopsin gene. That expresses then in specific neurons in the hypothalamus. We then insert a fiber optic cable attached to a laser through the same guide tube through which we deliver the virus, and then by pulsing the laser, we can activate within that structure only those neurons that express channel rhodopsin. So even if, as is true in many of these brain regions, the region itself is a sort of salt and pepper mixture of different kinds of neurons, with this technology, it's figuratively possible to activate the pepper without activating the salt. So what are the consequences of using this technology in particular classes of neurons in the hypothalamus? So what I'm going to show you here is a video where we are activating a certain group of neurons in the hypothalamus of this male mouse. And the white mouse is a female mouse. And now normally a male mouse will rapidly mount and mate with a female mouse after she's introduced in the cage. Keep your eye open here for a light. When that light turns on, we're flashing light pulses into the male mouse's brain through this fiber optic cable. He approaches, and now you see this typical flank attack biting behavior that is characteristic of how mice normally attack male mice. And when we turn the light off, the attack stops. And we can do this over and over and over again within the same behavioral episode. Now, is it possible that the effect of this manipulation is simply to confuse this mouse into thinking that this female is another male? We don't think so, because the same manipulation when presented in the presence of an inanimate object can elicit a similar behavior towards an inanimate object as well. In this case, an inflated rubber glove. So that indicates that activating these particular neurons in this region of the hypothalamus is sufficient to activate aggressive-like behavior. But now we can also address a second very important question. Are these same neurons necessary for naturally occurring aggressive behavior? And to do that, we can rely on an additional tool in the optogenetic toolbox. And this is a tool that inhibits the normal activity of neurons in response to light, called halorhodopsin. This is a pump that brings negatively charged chloride ions into a cell in response to yellow light and can effectively silence neurons and stop them from firing. So in this experiment, now if we can have the lights down, what we have is the fiber optic cable, if you could turn down the lights, is now in the mouse that normally resides within this cage. This is a resident mouse. And we have introduced into the same cage a stranger mouse, an intruder mouse, and that typically will elicit an attack by the resident towards the intruder who's invading his territory. And you can see here, when this light flashes, we're now activating this inhibitory opsin in the male mouse's brain. First is a control where you see him attack a mouse without any silencing. Now he starts another attack. We activate, and it stops the attack dead in its tracks. And that attack is stopped for as long as we are inhibiting those neurons. Here's another example. So by specifically inhibiting this particular group of neurons, we can interrupt ongoing attack behavior. So what these studies have taught us is that the neurons that are responsible in mouse for this type of attack behavior are highly localized in the brain, far more localized than was previously thought. In fact, if we deliberately try to activate neurons in adjacent regions that were previously implicated in aggression by more traditional studies, we don't see it. Now, interestingly, this region of the brain is very similar to a region of the brain implicated by studies of Donald Pfaff and his colleagues over 20 years ago in mating behavior in females. And our own studies from recording activity in neurons in this region of the brain indicate that these attack neurons are intermingled with neurons that are active during male-female mating behavior as well. However, when we try to activate these same types of neurons in a female brain, we do not elicit attack behavior. Rather, we elicit close investigation and sniffing. So how is it possible that activating what we think are the same neurons in the male and female mouse brain produces two radically different behaviors? Well, work from a number of laboratories, including one of my former students, Nirav Shah, has shown that there are sexual dimorphisms, differences in the brains of male and female mice in this region of the brain, both in terms of the connections that this region receives and in terms of the genes that are expressed. So you find genes that are expressed in this region of the male brain but not in females, and other genes that are expressed in this region of the female brain but not in males. So what I've told you from this section of the talk, the take-home messages are that aggression circuits are highly localized in the brain, that aggression and mating circuits are closely intermingled with each other, and that aggression circuitry is sexually dimorphic. Now, I'd like to turn for just a minute to our studies of aggression in flies. Flies, like other insects, exhibit aggressive behavior. At 30 frames per second, it doesn't look like much. This is a lunge where one fly rears up on its hind legs and snaps down on another. But at 3,000 frames per second, it's much more impressive. This is work from a group in Würzburg, and here is a particularly spectacular but rare example of aggressive behavior. Now, we like to use flies because they're small, inexpensive, they breed quickly, and they have very powerful genetic tools that are available for them. You may not be surprised to hear that flies can be bred for increased aggressiveness just like dogs. And this is work that was done by a colleague of mine, Ralph Greenspan, in San Diego. So you can breed Rottweiler flies just like you can breed Rottweiler dogs. What you might be more surprised to learn is that in flies, aggressiveness is also influenced by experience, social experience. So flies raised in social isolation are very aggressive, whereas flies raised in groups are relatively placid. Now, we asked whether those differences could reflect differences in gene expression in the brain, and we found that when we compared genes expressed in the brain of socially isolated and group-housed flies, they were different. And specifically, we could find genes that were increased in flies that were raised in groups. And one of those genes was independently identified by my colleague Ralph Greenspan in his screen for genetically hyperaggressive and non-aggressive flies. So what this indicates is that two different types of manipulations, social experience and artificial selection, can converge on the same genetic mechanism. So at the level of the gene, the influences of nature and nurture are essentially indistinguishable. Just because genes are involved in a behavior does not mean the behavior is immutable or deterministic. So what I've tried to tell you in the second part is that nature and nurture act to control aggression by influencing common genes, and that the conservation of aggression is controlled, can be seen at the gene level, we think, all the way from flies to humans. And our future studies, thank you, stop. Our future questions are aimed at understanding where the motivational and emotional components of aggression, what we would call anger, where are they encoded in the brain? Are there different types of aggression? Are they encoded in different circuits? And finally, do mice or flies show sort of social amplification or social contagion of aggression? And these are the people in my lab who are responsible for all of the work that I've shown you. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, as I promised you, is this one on again? I'm going to take 2 questions, ruthless. So, and please make it a question. I'm sure you have very interesting things to say, but put it in the form of a question, please. So, anybody have a quick question for David? He didn't scare you that much, this gentleman right here.
To knock out mice on that, and were there any unexpected observations of knocking out the gene?
Knockout genes in that particular peptide show a variety of different behavioral differences. The effects on aggression itself are not that pronounced, probably because that peptide does many things in different regions of the brain. Yeah.
Just in short, I'm curious, as you as a researcher, how do you decide what level of species of animal you're willing to work with? Like I noticed you're not doing the higher level, you're not doing the dogs, you're not doing the chimps, but how do you make a decision yourself?
Because our work is focused on understanding cells and genes that control this behavior. And right now, the tools that we use to ask those questions are best applied in organisms where we can do genetic manipulations, and flies and mice are 2 of the best systems for doing that. Maybe in the next 10 years, other organisms will become amenable to this level of experimental manipulation, but right now, these are the 2 best systems for doing it.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to ask David to sit down. I should point out, too, that for a scientist to actually share unpublished data in a public forum is actually a big deal, and I do want to thank David because that is very important. And this goes back to something that was said in, I think it was the plenary yesterday or the day before, this morning, this idea of making it a lot more open access in a system that doesn't currently permit this. So thank you for sharing that. Also, at this point, I'm very aware that the panel behind me is looking at David's data saying that females are not particularly aggressive, and knowing what they just put up with in the last hour before this panel, they're sort of, with me, they're completely sort of looking at David, you got that wrong, at least in my case. So now I'm going to turn this over to John Matani, who's going to take this up a level from single neurons and actually start looking at sort of aggression in a bigger group of some of our sort of closest compatriots. So, John, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Sarah. Have the slides. Biologists study the diversity of life at several different levels, from genes to neurons, to individuals, to entire species, and whole ecosystems. What I'd like to do is take this discussion of aggression and move it up a notch, as Sarah just indicated, away from the level of the neuron and gene, as we've just so elegantly heard from David Anderson, and now move this discussion to the group level. My model organism for this discussion will be our closest living relatives, the chimpanzee. For the past 18 years, I've been engaged in a long-term field investigation into the behavior of these organisms. My field site is the Kibale National Park, and Kibale is located in the southwest portion of the present-day East African country of Uganda. My field site is a place called Ngogo, and Ngogo lies right within the heart of this 800 or so square kilometer park. Lying at an altitude of about 1,400 meters above sea level, our Ngogo study site straddles an interface between lowland and montane rainforest. Now, part of our interest in the particular community of chimpanzees that resides here at Ngogo lies in its extraordinary size and structure. For with over 30 adult males and 50 adult females, you can see this is by far the largest community of chimps that's been described in the wild thus far. As a result of the extraordinary size of this community, it proves to be a relatively simple exercise to go out on any given day, find chimps, follow them, and observe and document aspects of their behavior that up until now have sometimes been difficult to describe, such as their intergroup aggression. Now, like many other animals, chimpanzees are territorial. Chimps range over territories that vary in size from 5 to 40 square kilometers, and they defend these territories. They defend them quite vigorously against members of other groups. Interactions between members of different communities are typically hostile. The unusual thing about chimpanzee territoriality is that sometimes those hostilities escalate. They escalate to the point where somebody falls victim. For male chimpanzees are known to make lethal coalitionary attacks on their neighbors. Now, boundary patrol behavior is an integral part of chimpanzee territoriality. And what happens here is really fascinating. Imagine, if you will, for a second, you're out with me, we're following a group of chimps. A few of them might be socializing, a few others perhaps feeding, some others in the distance calling. Continue to watch those chimps, and you might notice a few of them, typically male, rise and move off in single file fashion into the forest. They can move a few hundred meters, a kilometer or more, until they reach the boundary of their range. When they arrive there, their demeanor and behavior changes. It changes quite dramatically. Everybody falls completely silent. They start sniffing the ground, scanning the environment. They become attentive to any and all motion in the tree canopy. Sometimes the chimpanzees will continue on. They'll make a deep incursion into the territories of their neighbors. What the chimps appear to be doing is seeking signs, if not contact, with those neighbors. These boundary patrols are among some of the most distinctive and dramatic aspects in the behavior shown by chimps in the wild, and some of this has actually been caught on film, as was done a few years ago by my friends from the BBC while out at Ngogo filming for the Planet Earth documentary series. Let me take you on a patrol, and I will let Sir David Attenborough be your guide.
As they leave their core zone, the patrol goes silent, occasionally stopping to listen. Signs of the enemy are detected and examined closely. The chimp militia are now at the very edge of their territory. All need to be on maximum alert. They must wait and listen.
These patrols occur infrequently, once on average every 2 weeks or so. Because of this, it's taken an extraordinarily long time to develop a picture of what's actually occurring during these patrols in terms of who actually is participating, what's involved, how long do they go for, when they occur, and why they occur. After several years of study, we're now in a position to answer each of these questions. Beginning with the issue of participation, we know from studies at Ngogo and elsewhere that these are principally male affairs, involving both adult and adolescent males. At Ngogo, these patrols average or include on average about 13 individuals. Recently, we've been able to show that male chimpanzees quite literally get primed for these affairs. They display elevated levels of the male steroid hormone testosterone while on patrol. An even more interesting result is our associated finding that male chimpanzees actually show an anticipatory rise in testosterone immediately prior to patrolling. Additional observations indicate that these are non-trivial affairs. They last on average a couple of hours and cover about 2.5 kilometers. By way of comparison, if you're out with me following a group of chimps, we rise with them from the moment they wake up in the morning, follow them throughout the day until the time they go to bed. You will have covered, on average, a linear distance of about 3 to 4 kilometers. So this 2.5 kilometer distance is a fairly long distance, at least by chimp standards. We've known for quite some time that these are seasonally variable. There are some months that chimps patrol quite frequently, There are other months that they don't patrol at all. A few years ago, we conducted a series of analyses to examine some of the social and ecological factors that might account for the seasonal variation in patrolling behavior. And when we did, we discovered that a single factor, male subgroup or party size, was the best predictor telling us when the chimps might patrol. The reason for this probably lies in the fact that patrols are dangerous. Individuals run the risk of injury while on patrol. Worst case scenario is that somebody could die. And in order to reduce those risks, male chimps appear to seek safety in numbers by patrolling only when together with a lot of other individuals. Additional work by my former graduate student Sylvia Amsler indicates that there are other costs associated with patrolling. Patrolling is an energetically expensive activity, with patrollers traveling significantly more and feeding less while on patrol than during match control periods. And finally, we've been able to physiologically validate all this by showing that males, when on patrol, display elevated levels of cortisol. Cortisol is a so-called stress hormone. It's a physiological marker of stress. Now, given that all these costs exist and are associated with patrols, quite natural question to ask is, why do these animals patrol at all? After a decade of study, we now can address that question. Part of the answer lies in the fact that from time to time contact is made, contact with neighbors. Most of these events actually involve contact made over fairly long distances, where patrollers will hear their neighbors in the distance. They'll call back, a shouting match will ensue. They withdraw, and pretty much everything stays the same. But it's in some very rare encounters, especially in situations where there's a clear numerical asymmetry with many more patrollers than neighbors encountered. These are the situations that males will launch these lethal coalitionary attacks. One such attack is actually illustrated here, where a group of males from Ngogo have caught, they've isolated, they are now beating a male from another community. The victim lies hidden underneath this pile of chimpanzees. After pummeling that individual constantly over the short space of about 14 minutes, the victim lies dead. Now, as things turn out, the chimps that I study at Ngogo have the dubious distinction of being the world record holders for killing others. During the past 12 years, we've witnessed them kill 25 individuals from other groups. Most of the victims have come from an area that lies to the northeast of the Ngogo chimpanzee territory. In a dramatic series of events beginning a few years ago, the Ngogo chimpanzees have expanded their territory into the range once previously occupied by their victims. That area of territorial expansion represents about 6 square kilometers, or about a 20% increase in the Ngogo chimpanzee territory. So to review, chimps kill their neighbors. They appear to do so in an attempt to gain dominance over them. And if successful, they're able to acquire territory once previously occupied by their victims. These acts of lethal violence are some of the most shocking, if not disturbing, aspects of chimpanzee life. Here, too, some of this action has been caught on film. And to illustrate matters, let's resume that patrol we just started. I'll have Sir David again be your narrator. And just as a warning to perhaps the faint of heart, this will end badly.
The attack is on. To intimidate their opponents, the aggressors scream and drum on buttress roots. Several males corner an enemy female. It's a ferocious attack, and she's lucky to escape with her life. Others are not so fortunate. The battle won, a grisly scene unfolds. An enemy youngster has been caught and killed. The carcass is shared between members of the group and eaten. Killing a competitor makes sense if you want to protect your food supply. But exactly why they cannibalize the dead chimp is not fully understood. It may simply be a chance for some extra protein.
Many of you are probably sitting there asking yourself, what does any of this have to say about us as humans? Does the story of chimpanzee intergroup aggression mean that the roots of human aggression run deep? Well, as things turn out, that's a moot point. And it's an issue that has been and will continue to be debated over the years. The important thing to understand, as we'll hear next in some comments by Brian Ferguson, is that we are cultural animals. And as cultural animals, we have the capability of moving beyond the constraints imposed by our biology. So, for example, we've been shaped through millions of years of evolution to walk around on two legs. But despite the fact that we have these biological adaptations in our hips, in our legs, and our feet to move about in bipedal fashion, doesn't limit us to do so. There are some of us here in Oxford that ride bicycles. Others of us drive cars. Most of us have flown in planes from parts all over the world to be here today. So the message that I'd like to leave with you today is one that was emphasized last night by Bill Strickland, and that's a message of hope. A message of hope full of unlimited opportunities for you as social entrepreneurs to go out and disrupt things and affect real change that will limit the levels of violence and aggression that we face in the world today, thereby making this a more benign and peaceful place. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you, John. This mic's now on. Thank you. And I appreciate, obviously, seeing images like that are, they're chilling, but they're very real, and reality is something we have to deal with. 2 minutes, 2 questions. I see a gentleman over here.
Yesterday, Dr. Brundtland mentioned about the Vikings, and that the Vikings, when they went for war, there was some changes in woman behavior. And now, do you think, or is there an effect about when the group is going outside? Is there an effect on a female population?
Females.
Emancipation or behavior?
Females, for the most part, don't participate, although, as you saw, maybe if you were looking carefully in that very first video clip, there was a female with a small infant.
Don's looking at me now.
On patrol. So it's not as if this is exclusively and entirely a male affair. From time to time, females do tag along, but for the most part, it's limited to males. Does that answer your question?
Does the fact that the male are going outside to fight empower more the female that are left alone?
While they're being left alone? Yeah. That's a good... I'm sorry?
Are they Norwegian females?
That's a good question, but one that I'm not I'm sure that I can answer because I'm out with the boys as they're marauding.
That is always the excuse.
I can only be at one place at one time. I'm not.
I'll come with you on the next patrol. I'll check out.
I'm not
I'll check out the women.
omnipotent like the Norse gods.
Okay, one more question, please. This lady right here.
Are there observed examples of chimpanzees sharing territory with other groups?
No. There's, the territories aren't exclusively used. There's a fair bit of overlap in adjacent territories. So there's that sort of shared usage. But for the most part, individuals from one group or community are quite hostile to members of other communities. And that's been shown not only in my group, but other groups that have been studied across the continent of Africa.
Okay, thank you, John. Thank you again. And although I'm going to vote, David Attenborough is very cool, but I'm going to vote for Morgan Freeman to start doing these videos. Much better. So we're going to take it up another notch now and actually move to people. And as I'm sure most of you will agree, one of the manifestations of aggression that we're familiar with is war. However you couch that and whatever war you're talking about. And so Brian is going to talk a little bit about sort of the archaeology and anthropology of war and what we understand going back from many hundreds, thousands of years to the point we're at now, and to look at the sort of effective social contagion of aggression in that actual area. So I'm going to turn that over to Brian. Thank you.
Two tough acts to follow. I'll speak today on what anthropologists know about human warfare, and I'll cover a lot of ground, from prehistory to contemporary intrastate violence, though not wars between states. War is waged by individual humans, but not as individuals. War is inherently social, and what follows is about the social amplification and contagion of violence. Homo sapiens has always had the capacity for war, but humans have not always made war. Yes, always fear, aggression, and violence, but not always groups of men going out to kill members of other groups, despite recent popular books to the contrary. Beyond 15,000 BC, there is not enough evidence from anywhere in the world to come to firm conclusions. Some evidence suggests war occurred, but more goes against it. 3 of the initial instances of war, from Nubia around 11,000 BC, the Ukraine around 10,000 BC, and northern Australia around 4,000 BC, are noteworthy as being from times of massive environmental disruption. But to get a sense of war's development, I will now focus on 2 well-researched areas, Europe and the Near East. In Europe, skeletal signs of war appear in scattered locales during the Mesolithic, a time of increasing social complexity, beginning about 9500 BC. But most areas are free of that. Farming began in Europe around 5500 BC and spread unevenly thereafter. In most regions, 500 to well over 1,000 years then transpired with neither skeletal nor settlement evidence suggesting war. Then, at different times in different areas, war signs appear, and only one time, around Stonehenge, seemed to go away for a while. War continues to develop until, by the late Neolithic, 2800 BC, or the subsequent Copper Age, a cult of martial valor is visible across the continent, forerunners of the barbarians of recent history. We cannot know why the first wars of European prehistory began, but we can identify several preconditions that, in combination, make the onset of war more likely. Concentration of key resources, sedentism, heightened population density, food storage or livestock, social divisions creating separate collective identities, social and political hierarchy, monopolizable long-distance trade, and major ecological reversals. The Near East, excluding Mesopotamia, has different stories. One small area northeast of Mosul, spanning the Iraq-Syria border, is the heartland of war. Just 90 miles across, it contains, separated by millennia, several firsts. About 9,000 BC, 2 sites indicate the first known war in the Near East. Some 2,000 to 3,000 years later, there's the first clear fortification from anywhere in the world. Around 5800 BC, the Halafian culture became the first people known to spread by waging war, pushing through Anatolia to the Mediterranean. And around 3500 BC, Hamilcar is the first fortified city-state known to be conquered by southern Mesopotamians. Well before that, a network of trade and war stretched all the way to the Aegean, including Troy, connecting these origins to the war-making that has come down to us today. The likely basis of all this early concentrated warring was related to monopolistic control of trade in precious obsidian, which flowed down from the mountains near Mosul and then channeled to Mesopotamia and the Mediterranean coastlands. But elsewhere in the Near East, the southern Levant, from southern Syria through Lebanon, Jordan, and Israel, displays an entirely different prehistory. Starting around 13,100 BC, the many skeletons of the foraging, semi-sedentary Natufian people show some interpersonal violence, but nothing to suggest war. By 9600 BC, the Natufians were on the path to plant domestication. From that point, through successive agro-pastoral stages, up to 3200 BC, there are a few ambiguous cases, but no strong evidence of war, despite major climatic variations and population crashes. For the whole 10,000 years, only 2 adult males are known to have died violently. I recently published a dare on this. If I am wrong, and there is anywhere in the southern Levant over these 10,000 years where evidence shows the conclusion that war was present, name the place. So we'll see. Why no war? My hypothesis is that the stark contrast of the southern Levant to Europe and elsewhere in the Near East, where war signs abound, is that the people who domesticated nature also domesticated conflicts. They developed a peace system, including, archaeologically recovered, cross-cutting ties and interdependence, communal authority, redistribution of food, non-monopolistic trade, cultic integration, and, my guess, a value system of resolving conflicts without violence. 10,000 years without war, a remarkable testament to human nature. What ended the peace? The rise of the Scorpion King and the beginning of the Pharaonic Age in Egypt transformed its interaction with the Levant from balanced trade to imperial exploitation, pitting locals against each other as tribes emerged, and virtually every settlement of importance was fortified in an archaeological blink of an eye. Leaving Europe and the Near East and looking globally, preconditions developed and war began at very different times in different places. The 5th millennium BC along the Yellow River, 1550 BC in Oaxaca, and only 550 AD around the Middle Orinoco. From these initial centers, war diffused outwards. Ancient states dialed up militarization of tribal peoples at their peripheries and what we call tribal zones, such as the post-3200 southern Levant. Roman trade, for instance, fostered war along its routes, and Arab demand for slaves spread violence throughout eastern Africa. War kept getting more common in the world. In the 2 centuries bracketing 1300 AD, the last centuries before globalization began, huge climate swings led to horrible intensification of war through North America, South America, the Pacific, and probably beyond. I haven't looked yet. The tribal universe encountered by Europe's first and later explorers was a violent place. But even in the most violent areas today, the disruptive impact of Euro-American expansion transforms war and frequently intensifies it. Close examination of the very recent wars of the Venezuelan Yanomami, made famous by Napoleon Chagnon as revealing mankind in a Hobbesian state of nature, are predictively explained not by fighting over women or revenge, but by antagonisms generated by unequal access to and competition over introduced steel trade goods. Anthropologists have learned that to understand primitive warfare, it must be situated in a historical context. Historical contextualizing leaves room for and enhances anthropology's great advantage in understanding war. We can cross-culturally compare war and society holistically. Still, I hazard 3 broad generalizations. War responds to practical material interests in terms of critical resources and their cause, security against attack, and political self-interest. 2, these interests are structured by the entire social organization of people, their interacting systems of kinship, exchange, and politics. 3, structured by social organization, material interests are conceptualized in terms of culturally specific psychologies, including modal personalities, beliefs, values, symbols, and behavioral scripts. One interesting thing about the Euro-American tribal zones is that across centuries and around the world, patterns of war among socially comparable types of indigenous societies exhibit striking behavioral similarities, but are conceptualized by local peoples in strikingly different ways, appropriate to local cultures. My argument is that those who decide on war come to conceptualize their own self-interest in terms of the culture's highest applicable moral values, both to persuade others and to justify themselves to themselves. That idea directs analysis to interests of decision makers, which vary tremendously by political system, including how war or peace affects their standing within their own group. What about biology? What I have just described may fairly be characterized as a rationalist approach to war, calculated decisions shaped by social forces and cultural values. Yet the importance of emotions is on plain view in any instance of war. Fear and aggression, yes, but also altruism and cooperation, which themselves have evolved and developmental neurobiological bases, as John's work shows. This suggests another needed but quite problematic synthesis of the rational and the emotional, when even the emotions are culturally shaped. The anthropological approach to tribal warfare just outlined applies to recent large-scale conflict within states, where identity-linked mass violence, from civil war to terrorism to ethnic cleansing to genocide, has killed millions. In all, we can see the pursuit of practical self-interest combined with powerful cultural values, all structured by existing social relations and history. These interests and values are played by leaders on game fields responding to both local and global trends and forces. Such violent conflicts are variously labeled ethnic or tribal or sectarian or whatever conflicts. I call them identarist, to highlight the historically contingent fusing of who you are, identity, and how you are doing, interest. Identarist groups and identarist violence is constructed along potential fault lines of ethnicity, tribe, or sect. That's true. But they also can reflect race, language, lineage, geography, position on the rural-urban continuum, relationship to sources of wealth and power, and more personally, gender, generation, and age. If you don't understand this complex mixing and morphing of identarist bases, you will not understand an identarist conflict. There are common processes to these horrors. With considerable oversimplification, the social and symbolic definition of us versus them is pushed by leaders at multiple levels whose positions and interests are served by confrontation and violence. They create and fuel a narrative of historical and contemporary grievances that resonates with the lived experience and knowledge of followers. Fear is cultivated, aggression evoked. Both are employed in the necessary processual step of eliminating middle ground. But altruism, too, can be critical and encourage willingness to sacrifice oneself for one's people. Then comes the violence, often performative, with deliberate atrocity carrying heavy messages about perpetrators and victims for a larger audience. When a person's identity is put in mortal danger, the self, it may be that reactive emotions of fear, aggression, and altruism are particularly engaged. Although cultural predispositions to violence seem bred into cultural bones, they're not inevitable. We've all known about in the U.S. military zone of Afghanistan and Pakistan, we've all read about the martial creed of the Pashtuns. That's true. But then there is remarkable and remarkably unknown Abdul Ghaffar Khan, who in 1920s Pakistan used the same values to build a nonviolent peace army. Ultimately, this movement was suppressed by those with vested interest in heightening conflict and opposition. That happens. Nonviolent movements have very mixed results, as the Arab Spring demonstrates. Yet these movements take a stand against violence, and often they work, from Gandhi to King to Eastern Europe and beyond, and they are growing around the world now. Does anthropology have anything practical to offer? Of course, anthropology will not replace other efforts, but building a sustainable, equitable peace is very complicated and difficult. There is much international support to deal with shooting wars and long-term development, not so much for the sometimes long incubation periods before and the recover periods just after. That is where anthropology comes in, to better understand the vectors of violence in order to illuminate alternative paths to constructive cooperation. The Pentagon belatedly realized that local cultural knowledge is essential as they retool for counterinsurgency. They were avid suitors of anthropology, but we spurned them because the military uses ethnographic intelligence for lethal purposes, and because, more broadly, counterinsurgency seeks to reduce violence by intensifying top-down control. That's a bigger issue than just active counterinsurgency. Just a week ago, the New York Times reported that the 23,000 Special Operations Forces of the U.S. military is now being pivoted to Africa, Asia, and Latin America to promote U.S. security interests before potential threats turn into wars, by building up local security forces of all sorts and gathering local intelligence just in case. Broadly, efforts to foster combined goals of security and development may be seen by repressive at those at the bottom. So one must go for both peace and justice. I'm an academic. Academic anthropologists are rarely asked what to really do about anything. At my school, we're trying something new, maybe even entrepreneurial. We have created a new MA program in peace and conflict studies based in anthropology and sociology. Our goal is to give graduates the ability to understand any situation of mass conflict holistically, to understand possibilities of averting violence before it happens, and to help reconstruct a less conflicted society after violence. For more than 3 decades, I have studied war. Directing this new program has made me more aware of contemporary efforts to build sustainable peace. The field is expanding by leaps and bounds. Google Peace Building 2.0 to see. This broad network tilts largely to practitioners, policies, programs, institutions, and studies. It is a domain ripe for entrepreneurialization. However, as I recently looked at social entrepreneurs after being dazzled by their good and innovative good works, I am puzzled by their lack of emphasis on sustainable peace. Yet nothing will destroy your good works faster than a raging, atrocity-filled war. Peace building and social entrepreneurship could be a match made in heaven. And this not need be your prime directive. Doing what you already do, you could add a central role of interveners should circumstances demand. For instance, if an identitarist riot threatens, you could counter inflammatory rumors, identify explosive situations in real time, or call attention to police complicity. If you are prepared, you could be first responders for peace. In closing, a final thought. Sarah, they asked you how you would envision the world 50 years hence. I know my answer: no more war. Is world peace a possibility? I believe it is.
Thank you, Brian. 2 questions. Gentleman over on the back there.
I hate to counter such an optimistic ending, but I'm curious what you see as the sort of depersonalization of war through the use of drones and, devices now that remove at least one side of the human equation from war. Does that change things?
It is a form of depersonalization, although the people who are operating the drones seem to be having the same kind of psychological problems with people who are killing face-to-face. So it's not quite as depersonalized as maybe it was hoped. The technological advances, I'm not talking about something that's going to happen immediately, but that is certainly a change. The fact that they can shoot down a drone with a laser, which was pointed out 2 days ago, is quite revolutionary. Where are we going with that? I think we're getting ready for the alien invasion. But what I'm talking about is something that, if you look around the world, you compare the world today, not just to the 1990s, but to the 1980s, to the 1970s, so much of the world that was racked by war during those decades does not see war now. It doesn't mean it's an irreversible process. It's eminently reversible. But there is grounds for optimism there.
Right in the middle. We have a mic right there.
Thank you very much. Keeping in mind what the United States of America went to both world wars, I think it's totally different for the reasons. It's different than what they've been going to war recently. Keeping this in mind, do you think that wars in general have certain ethics? And if there are, what is it, that can prevent us from going to war in the next 50 years or so?
Well, wars are played out according to cultural understandings of proper behavior. What is, as an anthropologist, what's sometimes disturbing is that what we see as atrocity may be proper behavior by the people who are carrying out. So the ethics of war are something that really are different by different circumstances and cultures. In terms of, the last part of the question was about the future?
Yes, if the ethics of this kind of ethics will be able to prevent people to go to war, in the future.
Well, I don't think that ethics, Paul Farmer's an anthropologist, and he was the only person in the opening session who mentioned war. And he was talking about causality in culture, and we share the same views here. What's happening in the future is happening without us guiding it. But I think that if there is now a kind of a world culture, and this is an example of it, part of it, where to envision the possibility of being without war. We've heard from 2 people who look at things biologically, but they're both talking about how these can be shaped by social or cultural, by behavioral circumstantial experience. So if we come up with a value system that says that this is something, if we envision the possibility of peace, it's something that I think could make a contribution. And it can make a contribution at a more ground level in what I was discussing before about entrepreneurs being first responders to prevent outbreaks in their own areas.
I'm gonna close that down for a second, but this does move us nicely on to the final sort of scientist in the panel, and when we talk about aggression, what constitutes normal versus pathological aggression? I mean, if you're trying to fight for resources in a resource-poor community as an animal, I mean, that's normal behavior, but what takes it to the realm of pathological, psychological, whatever you want to call that? So I'm going to invite Simon up now. We'll bring him away from the naughty chair now to talk about this. He's an expert in studying this in many different realms, and will share with us what that looks like and how it can look different and what we expect from people and whether we expect them to go from being normal to, quote, pathological behavior, and should we expect that, I think.
Yes, well, I think I will actually, yes, now, because you were so rude to me when I was not spectacular. I'm so upset. I'm so upset. I'm a psychiatrist, which is an unspectacular profession, and I'm also even more. I'm also even more uncool. My other trade is I'm an epidemiologist, which means I don't normally get out of bed for less than 2,000 people, and you're the exception. Now, I have other roles as well. I direct a Centre for Military Health at King's, and we also have an MSc, by the way. You're also very welcome to come on that. And I'm the psychiatrist, the advisor in psychiatry for the British Army. So I've trained in forensic psychiatry and been involved in some interesting high-profile cases, including the Breivik case that you were mentioning over there. Now, Brian's been talking on a grand scale about culture and war, taking us from 9,000 years ago in Mesopotamia through pre-Columbian America, ending up in various modern societies. I'm going to take you on a little different tour, rather closer to home. I'm going to start in the pubs of Colchester, an Essex town, home to Para, part of the Parachute Regiment. We might visit a camp in Cyprus, where the British military does its decompression. The Royal Marines have just left there, leaving it in something of a state. And we will, however, go back briefly to the battlefields of Mesopotamia, or southern Iraq, as we call it now. Because, as I say, my role both as a researcher of, an observer of, and advisor to the British Army, I've observed them for many years in very many different capacities. And they're a wonderful example, I'm going to suggest to you, of a very particular microcosm and culture of violence. Now, the profession of arms is, of course, the profession of violence. Aggression is part of the trade. It's what they do for a living. But equally, well, at least since 1648, when the modern state arrives in part of Westphalia, and the state starts to become the control of the monopoly of violence for the first time ever, with the formation of what are recognizably modern armies for the first time in history, armies and the state are also not just about the profession of violence, but about the control and limitations of violence. So they have this unique role of, on the one hand, promoting violence, but on the other hand, restraining as well, both among the people in certain missions that they do, but most of all among the soldiers themselves. And it's a very thin line that we see between these two things. Among individual soldiers, one soldier one day can be a hero feted in the newspaper, and the next day can be a villain castigated in the courts. The dividing line between a medal and a court-martial can be very, very thin indeed. Now, psychiatrists, historians, and indeed soldiers themselves have been concerned, literature really now going back over 150 years, as to what is it that makes men fight. Next year is the 100th anniversary of the First World War. And if we went back to then and we asked the commanders of the First World War what was it that made their soldiers fight, they would have been very clear in their answers. They would have said people fight for patriotism and for ideology, for king and country, for Kaiser und Heimat, or whatever. And on the individual, they might say, yes, of course, that matters as well. People fight because they have courage, because they have character, because they have leadership. So they're taking very grandiose concepts of patriotism, ideology, and then plus individual issues around character. But this proved to be, as an explanation of why some people fought better than others and some people didn't fight at all, very unsatisfactory. It explained, and to this day continues to explain a little bit, as to why people might join up to fight for a cause, but it didn't explain at all why they actually did or didn't. It didn't explain performance on the battlefield. And in World War II, the focus changed very much. British commanders and American commanders found very quickly the old exhortations to patriotic reasons for fighting were often booed and hissed and seemed very incapable of motivating people, partly because, of course, of their memories of the First World War, but nevertheless towards the activity of combat. And attentions then changed very much, often partly on the influence of psychoanalysis, but on other things as well, from the grandiose ideological explanations to the very individual and particular. And in particular, the impact of psychology, group psychology, and small group psychology in particular. New doctrines emerged based this time on empirical evidence to suggest that men actually really fought for their mates. They fought, as one commentator said at the time, men fought for love. They fought because now they were belonging in small groups. People realized that the optimal size of a fighting unit was 8, 9, or 10, the platoon. Interesting that 10 groups of fruit flies seem to be unaggressive, is that right? Okay, well, unfortunately, that makes people very aggressive. And that's the maximum number in which people fight, because that's the maximum number of incredibly close, intimate bonds that people can sustain. That's why, to this day, most militaries are organized as groups of 10 or 8, it depends on which one you look at. And that doctrine has remained there ever since the Second World War. The great classics of the Second World War of military sociology, cohesion, and psychiatry are still taught to this day in military academies around the world. Now, ideas as to why people cease to fight have changed dramatically. Groups and the kind of sociological explanations have rapidly disappeared to be replaced by very individual explanations, as in the concept, the very modern concept, in fact, it's already been mentioned, of post-traumatic stress disorder, about trauma, a very modern word. Only very, very recently has trauma had any emotional significance at all. Up until about 30 years ago, if you look at trauma in a textbook, it refers to physical trauma and not emotional trauma. And the word traumatized really had no meaning in the way it does now until very, very recently indeed. But as I say, the importance of group psychology in terms of explaining motivation as opposed to demotivation has remained. But what about when it goes wrong? What about when the control of violence, which is the essence of a military culture, of an army, which is about the control of violence, what happens when that disintegrates? What happens when all the rules, written and unwritten, the laws, the codes, the rules of engagement, of discipline, and all these things, what happens when they collapse and things change? Well, I was involved in a case, which those of you from Britain will know about, called the Baha Mousa case. In September 2003, the British Army raided a hotel in Basra in South Iraq. They arrested the inhabitants of that hotel and they were detained in custody. They were then savagely beaten up, and one of them, Baha Mousa himself, who was a hotel receptionist, was murdered over a 48-hour period. It was a dramatically terrible incident. I then had to interview the 16 surviving Iraqis from that episode, and obviously not Mousa, he was dead, but I also interviewed his father. And we built up a picture from their accounts. It wasn't supplemented very much from the military accounts themselves because they didn't give any. One of the kind of bad things of group cohesion is that they stick together like limpets. And if you look into the court-martials that subsequently took place, and you put in the words, "I can't remember," you get 8,000 hits. So, but we did pick up a view as to what had happened. They'd gone to this hotel to pick up, on intelligence reasons, a suspect from the beginnings of the Shia insurgency in Basra. However, due to military incompetence, as they arrived at the hotel, the insurgent suspect himself simply jumped through the window and ran out of the back. They'd forgotten to put a picket round the back, a violation of the normal standard procedures they have. So the guy they wanted had gone away. He had buggered off and was never in fact seen again. So now the soldiers were in control of the hotel. Mousa, the receptionist, called his father. His father was a colonel in the Iraqi police and indeed had been trained in England and spoke perfect English. He arrived, and as he arrived, he discovered 3 of the soldiers were in the act. They'd broken into the hotel safe and were stealing all the money. He then went and told the junior officer in charge, who came down and remonstrated with the men for theft. As a response, they decided to arrest everyone in the hotel anyway. They then brought them back to the camp, and over the next 48 hours, they were systematically abused, and indeed Mousa died. So what had gone on then was 2 insults that had happened to this particular group of soldiers. One was a violation of their professional codes of behavior, their pride as it was. They had been incompetent in the organization of the raid. They'd let the guy get out of the back. And the second was they'd been caught in the act of thievery. It was shame. So they'd experienced this powerful emotion. One was their loss of pride, and the second was the onset of shame. And as I say, that group identity that previously we'd been promoting as being a good thing had now turned against itself and also made it very difficult to find out what on earth had gone on. So what does this tell us then? In general, the state, the military, as we were to call it, has really good ways of controlling the bad behavior of soldiers. And indeed, we recently, 10 days ago, we published a big study in The Lancet, and we looked at the rates of offending across the British Armed Forces, a study we've been running for 10 years. And you'll be surprised to learn that overall, the rate of criminal offending in members of the British Armed Forces, including the Army, is dramatically lower than in people who are not in the forces. And that's remarkable because if you know anything about where the military recruit from, they recruit in particular from the deprived, from the socially run down and pretty bad parts of the United Kingdom, a euphemism for Scotland. And, there aren't any Scots social entrepreneurs, are there? I'm just checking about that. I had a guess, I had a look. There didn't seem to be no one from Scotland. Oh, there is. Okay, well, I retract that then. I'll use the word Liverpool instead. Okay. But, so overall then, taking a large number of very difficult, disadvantaged people who've been in care and had all sorts of social disadvantage visited on them, actually various things that the military have done in terms of discipline and morale, cohesion, comradeship, pride, self-esteem, all of the things that they do has dramatically reduced the rate of offending, except for one area, which is violent offending. And violent offending is unfortunately dramatically higher. From 7%, it goes up to 20%, which is a very high rate, sometimes of very serious violence indeed, at various times. It's linked to social deprivation, also linked to combat, alcohol misuse, and mental disorder. So then, what is I'm saying here? So war is, of course, about violence, but militaries are also about the control of violence. And the balance between the two is often a very complicated thing. Now, how does this relate to you? Well, frankly, I don't know. But I do know that in war conflicts, and indeed countries that haven't been associated with war, returning soldiers can be something of a social problem. There isn't any grand explanation for this. I've given you about the British Army views, but of course, or the British experiences, but it'll differ. The issue on local histories, local politics, local circumstances. The problems of child soldiers in sub-Saharan Africa are very different to the kind of readjusting Russian Afghani veterans with their far-right ideology, or the demoralized veterans of Bosnia and Croatia with their ridiculous pension policies, or the inequalities of healthcare that affect the US veterans. These are all very different things, but in all these countries, what they have in common is, in general, being military service is good for many things, but it does seem to be associated with not just violent behavior in war, but an increased propensity to violent behavior on return. So as we move then from molecules to man, the challenge we have to face is how the same person can at one time, and this is what happened in the Musa case, those guys who were involved, who murdered him, were also heroes who'd been given medals for their courage in combat. The same person can be, in a very short space of time, can switch from being the brave hero to the violent villain. Thanks. That wasn't what you talked about.
Thank you. Thank you, Simon, although you do know where I was born, don't you?
No, I'm guessing it's Scotland now.
No, funnily enough, Liverpool.
Oh, really?
He's getting his own back. He's getting his own back. 2 questions very quickly. Or maybe not.
Oh, well, okay. Useless lot, aren't they?
No.
Oh, wait, there's one guy.
One brave person.
No, not a question of bravery. And actually, it's not a question to yours, but since there is the space, actually, it goes a bit back to, well, in general, humans, but also animals. There is one colleague of yours, neuroscientist John Desity, who showed that rats can actually show empathy. In Chicago professor, I think. Now, my question is it needed for species to demonstrate aggression in order to be able to demonstrate empathy?
I don't know the answer to that. I do know...
Maybe your colleagues.
Well, I do know that among soldiers, you find a vast range of emotions, and quite remarkable how people can change their emotions very quickly, from the kind of stoic resilience that is promoted in war to then remarkable when they're bereaved. And if you witness a repatriation ceremony of a body from Afghanistan, as I have, you can see a whole unit a tough unit that will then also break down in tears, and then they'll say, right, it's over, crack on, and then they'll move back again. So they're certainly capable of remarkable switches in very powerful emotions very, very quickly. And as having empathy for the people, well, that's the reason why platoon sizes are the size they are, because there's a limit to the number of people you can have that feeling of empathy with, so much so that you're willing to fight with them and possibly die with them. And it's not much more than about 10. Okay. So rats.
we can take this into panel tomorrow in the question and answer, sort of the informal chat tomorrow. But I want to quickly move on to, because mindful of the fact that I want to keep the sort of 20 minutes if I can for having all of you start to really engage with the panel and some questions. I'm going to invite Teddy Blacher to come and step up for a few minutes and talk a little bit about his view on this. And he's known as, I'm sure many of you know, a pioneer of sort of free tertiary education movement in South Africa. I won't say much more, but I want him to share his few thoughts about what the importance of aggression and violence and why we need to understand more of that.
Great.
Teddy.
Thank you so much. You may be wondering, what exactly education in South Africa has got to do with fruit flies and mice and chimpanzees, but there actually is a pretty strong link, and Simon was touching on this about how the same people can switch. Social entrepreneurs of all kinds, and we're amongst so many incredible social entrepreneurs here in Oxford, face so many challenges when they're trying to do the work that they do every day. And we're in the field of education, and so theoretically we shouldn't have to deal with issues of violence and aggression, and so on. We should just be doing teaching people math and computer science and so on. But actually what happens is all these conflicting things get in the way, and social entrepreneurs, we have to find things that work. Bottom line, all that matters is, can we solve the problem? And we always believe we can solve the problem, but sometimes we have to do unconventional, unusual things if we want to do things that seem impossible. So South Africa today, we're 20 years now into this new democracy. We're a free country. Amazing revolution for peace happened in 1994. Nelson Mandela coming into power, etc., and the ANC. And so you'd think now in this country of peace, that peace would really mean peace. Everybody can vote, everybody has the right to go into education at school level and so on. But what we see is actually that's not the case at all. And all the violence that has been there over all these decades of brutality in the country left very deep psychological scars on people. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, but that actually affects the ability to do anything in the country. South Africa spends the third highest of any country in the world on education. We spend 230 billion rand in a year, a ton of money, of state money on education. But last year in global competitiveness ratings, we were 144th in the world out of 145. So we were the absolute worst. And we get that every single year. We just do worst in math and in science and in each of these different tests where we're competing against the rest of the world. And people in South Africa really, they scratch their heads, and we're throwing money at this problem, and we're building schools, and billionaires throw money at this problem. So many organizations, but it doesn't seem to change. And so what we've really realized is that there's something deeper going on that is not just about putting a child in a classroom and giving them a book and a math teacher if you want them to learn and to become successful. And when you look into the deeper issues that are going on, today in South Africa, 1 in 3 children grow up with 2 parents or in a stable family background. Some big research has just come out. 67% are growing up with either 1 or no parents or a foster parent. This is obviously having an effect on them. And all this insidious violence that was there for so long has led to an enormous amount of violence in the country. So we have 250,000 women violently attacked in South Africa every year. Rapes, huge gang violence. We've got millions of youth unemployed, roam the streets. get into all types of things that are so shocking, really in this peaceful country. So when we think about this, well, then really peace doesn't mean peace. And the fact that people can vote and we have a stable democracy actually means very little. We just did a test. So we've been building free universities for the last 14 years. We've been in the space for 18 years. And what we set out to prove was something when all this money was being spent in the country and people were saying, we've got to be able to fix education through all the stuff we're doing, and they weren't finding results. We wanted to prove that the poorest of the poor, the most battered people who've been raped, abused, in street shelters, etc., that not only could they rehabilitate themselves and become successful in society, they could become chartered accountants and work as computer programmers and stockbrokers, merchant bankers. Why? Because people would think it's impossible. And we wanted to prove that every human being is a genius waiting to happen, but we have to treat them as a whole person. We cannot just put the teacher in the classroom and think that everything will happen. So we've built 6 of these free institutions, and we've now helped over 6,000 youth from these kind of backgrounds. Some of them have been prostitutes, some of them have been in street shelters, sniffing glue at young ages and so on, who now are working in international finance and et cetera, and we've helped about 4,500 become entrepreneurs. But we've had to deal with this issue of violence, and some other colleges that have set up in the country that don't deal with these kinds of issues have had to close down because students burn down the school, they attack the teachers, all this kind of stuff goes on. So we don't start with education. When students come into us, we start with peace. We start with teaching them to know themselves, to love themselves, about greatness, about what a human being is and can become, and help them make this kind of switch from violent thinking and that violence begets violence to really break those kind of patterns in their own lives, which are often extremely difficult. So we start with love, and we start with meditation. We start with all these things that no other university ever thinks about. And as a result, over 90% of our students make it through, graduate, become extraordinary people in society, and many of them are leading companies and are in government and so on. The last point I just wanted to make is just like violence does beget violence, and we all know that how violence spreads, peace begets peace. And that's really our philosophy, is that if we can turn educational institutions into lighthouses of peace and centers of peace that actually radiate peace in society, we can spread peace amidst all this incredible violence we see amongst the youth in our country. So we use this method that we call consciousness-based education, and I won't go into it in detail, but just this idea of collective consciousness and group consciousness, that when people do meditate together and they do practices of peace, that this actually spreads in society. And some very interesting initial research that we've been doing is looking at what happens to levels of violence in areas where we've created universities. Going to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Teddy. It's wonderful to hear some amazing activities that are going on. I'm going to quickly invite Caroline Bacteri, who has had many years of experience in sort of mobilizing people around education and sanitation and women empowerment, and the list goes on. So I'm going to ask her to share her story before we then move on to sort of 15 minutes of bringing you all into the conversation. So,
thank you, Sarah. Good afternoon. I'll just try to make best of my 5 minutes. And I will be building on what Ted has already explained in context of Pakistan. My work with the community since '78 has led me to the creation of this Institute for Development Studies and Practices, which is now University of Community Development. The way this university has come into being is my work with the young people. Young people are more than 60% of Pakistan's population, between 15 and 35. More than 80% of this population is outside the formal education system, and thus outside the livelihood opportunities. And it is building, it is growing with no direction. It's like a time bomb. What we have been doing is, or my lessons have been, and I'm building on that lessons, reached to the university, creation of the University of Community Development is, being a woman, I was very closely associated in the families of the youths, and also with the men of the family and the communities. So I had the both perspective of how our young people are nurtured and trained in the family, on the streets, and how they are picked up by the vested interest from the inside and outside the country power structures. It led me to that family was responsible for providing basic love and security to their children, to the small growing ones, and to the adolescent when the age is very, very sensitive. I find the girls, as they grow up in their families and enter into early adolescence, they are really sided out, that no touching or that love from the father or the sister or brother or the uncle or the aunt that she was used to. And then the boys, as soon as they are 10, 14, between 10 and 13, 12, they are ousted from the house, that no more being associated with the women of the family, the mother, the sisters, the aunts, no more touching, no more being close to them. He is supposed to be a man and he should be out all the time. Not too much, spending too much time with the women in the family. Now this was done more than often in a very crude way, not in a very gentle manner or in an educational way. It is just shoving them out and creating this segregation very harshly. This I saw that girls were, even though they were segregated in a very rough way, but still they were protected inside the house. But the boys who were shoved outside, who had nowhere to go, and at this stage the boys who were going to school were also dropping out very fast, because at this time they are in 5th or 6th grade, it gets very tough for them and they drop out a lot. So the age group that they are in, there is no support system outside or inside, and they are left on their own to struggle through this adolescent confusion of their lives. This is the best time that they are picked up by the groups outside, and nobody knows where their life goes, who takes them, in which fundamentalist institutions they go to, which drug mafia picks them up. Nobody knows. It's too late always when the family comes to know about it. We discovered this in our institute when they would come into our courses and into our university development classes, and we realized that whenever we have a four structure learning process. First is self-development, just working with your own self, and this is when the stories comes out, and we come across such violent behavior or aggression all built up into them that it is unimaginable. There were times when we were in great threat with the schemes and the plans that they had come almost twice to destroy our courses, to the extent of blowing us up. Somebody had sent them to do that. But our self-development 3 months had really, we worked through them, getting all the aggression out, why things happen, the isolation, the fear. All this thing builds a very unknown fear in them, a fear of losing face, fear of failure, fear of leaving the family, fear of not being successful, fear of not delivering as a boy, who's meant to take care of the family, of the older father who's getting older. It is his responsibility, and still not being prepared to take that. So many traps that young person is in. So we take the person through, and then when they reach to a certain level, then we help them connect back to the family. It is the responsibility of the family to give that basic fundamental love to their child. So if we work with the family, and then how he gets back to the family, or she, they have to trace their family history. We just train them, find out more about your family. Go back 100 years, 200 years, how many years you want to go. And when they go back, they start connecting with the oldest one, with the most elderly woman in the family, most elderly woman in the extended family, or a man. First time we find that they're talking and connecting with the family members whom they had lost touch. But the history becomes a center point for the whole family to join this young man or a woman, because everybody is interested in tracing it down. So stories comes out from the history, and that they document it, they come in and give it as a seminar, as it's a family seminar, and the family members also come. So this connection, self-connection with the family. Once the family comes back the young person up, then we try to break another fear that facing the community and working with the community to extend your developed self. So community development comes in for the next 2 months, and we take them through. From the community development, community development project starts coming up of this young person, and he or she starts gaining that spirit, that self-esteem back, that self-respect back, and the connections are made throughout. Throughout the connections we make to weed out the fears, the unknown fears of that young person. And by the 4th stage, he or she gets connected with the local governance, and by this time they are very good in, on the internet, on the computers, and we help them connect to the world of their own age group with the youth of England, youth of Australia, youth of all over the country. So they get connected how other people in the world are doing what they want to do. So that's the course that we have for a 6 months course, which is now a university, and they come out of their own ideas, entrepreneurs. But here the bottom line is that I find our young people, they are good. To begin with, they are all very good, no problem with them. But the fear that they are carrying in themselves, there is no avenue I see in our society or in our system to address that. And that is, I feel that's a need of the time, and we are trying to address that, but it is so challenging in a country where people have such different priorities. Who is going to listen to me that I am tackling each person's fear? But I'll keep doing it. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. So we've taken you through a very brief, it may seem long, but a very brief journey through the emotional brain and science and anthropology of aggression at very many different levels. Obviously, what would be wonderful is if we had the immediate answers from science or from the social entrepreneur group of when and how to intervene effectively, so that aggression in a form that's not useful or helpful, or that's a deterrent to whether it's education or families or whatever it is, we want to get rid of that. And I'm going to give you 3 thoughts, and then I would like everybody who's really working in this world to start putting your hands up and asking questions or telling us what you see, so that the scientists can also hear from you. And we have 10, 15 minutes here. But let me throw these 3 things out. If I think about aggression and violence and its role in a variety of social issues, and ask you this question: to what extent do you as a group of social entrepreneurs feel that violence, aggression, is a major obstacle to accomplishing the objectives that you have? And if there was one thing that science, any type of science, could do to actually help you understand the behavioral underpinnings of aggression and overcome the violence, the aggression, or intervene at a certain point, what would it be? And then finally, if you had a choice, if you were directing all the funding into scientific research, should scientific research focus on understanding what promotes peace and social contagion of peace, and good behavior, or specifically on aggression? So I'll throw those things out for thought, but that's certainly not something you have to stick with. And I'll invite the first brave soul to actually raise their hand and start talking. And I see a lady right at the back. So if you could tell us what you do, then that would help us with your question.
I'm a filmmaker. I'm here as Sundance media advisor, but I run a project called Not in Our Town. It's about community response to hate crime. So we create films, stories, and do community engagement on the ground. And I want to thank this incredible panel for naming some of the issues that I think we're all exploring. And I was really struck by your coinage of the term, which may be old but new to me, identitarist, which I think is really vital, particularly in our work about talking about hate violence and how it manifests. And I'm on my way to Hungary right after this and sort of looking at some of the challenges there, and I think that's a really powerful term. I also want to talk about something that we see. So in our work, in order to deal with hate violence, you have to go back, and so we have a whole anti-bullying project. And one of the ideas that's really powerful, and I thought about it when you were talking, Taddy, is this idea of identity safety and trying to create identity-safe environments for children, which then passes up to the whole community. And I wonder if that's part of your work there. It really comes from Claude Steele's ideas, who's at Stanford, about stereotype threat and the, the dangerous effects of that, and identity safety as an antidote. And I wonder if that's something that you've been thinking about. And one more thing, if Brian Ferguson can unpack this whole notion of altruism and how it works with aggression and what role they could play. You talked about this sort of mix where something could happen. I thought that was really powerful as well.
Taddy, do you want to take a first shot at that? And then I'm actually going to ask David to follow on with this idea that what he didn't talk about, but what is interesting is the developmental profile of aggression, whether in young mice, young flies versus old ones, because you touched on do you intervene in the young, what stage to sort of intervene. So Taddy, do you want to go ahead? Just keep it quick so we can get everybody.
I think just very briefly, I mean, this idea of creating like a safe space for youth is so essential. We've just been running a test on 138 of our new students coming in, and these are just students coming out of the school system, public system, and we ran a test that war vets coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan go through, and you don't register on this test unless you've got just psychotic, stages of PTSD and just massive stress where, the kind of fear and violent behavior and thinking and so on that Coretta Lane was talking about. And of these 138 students, 50% of the women were showing stress levels similar to war veterans coming back from the war. And these are just young South African people, and 32% of the men. And so the thing is that people are, as you're talking about, they're in areas that are just so violent where they just grow up surrounded by all this kind of chaos. We try to create, these like havens of safety and peace, and we take the students away on leadership camps and things like this so that they can start to form a new set of bonds with peers, which works in a different way to what they're used to in their own community. And it is essential. We just have to take people, out of that situation and keep on getting them to be in a new set of peers.
We haven't done too much formally on this, but we have looked at how long it takes for social isolation in mice to have an influence to promote aggressiveness. And it takes a remarkably long time, something on the order of 6 to 8 weeks, which is a long time for a mouse. And in the absence of this social isolation, which is remarkable, the group housing trumps all of the genetic influences that we have seen so far on violence. So if you isolate the animals, more aggressive strains show this heightened aggressiveness, less aggressive strains show less aggression. But if you group house them, all of them show a low level of aggression. So the fact that it takes so long for social isolation to promote aggressiveness gives me hope that at least in humans, if that's true, there is time to intervene. And we've seen in flies that these effects are reversible. And so I would say that the important thing is to look for early indications of tendencies toward violence and stress-related emotional lack of control and try to intervene as early as possible. But there is time.
Which is effectively, Carlene, what you were saying is if you bring them back within a community instead of leaving them in isolation, that there is that opportunity. I don't want to go too much into altruism. If you go back a few panels, Skoll panels back, we did a whole thing on altruism. But did you have anything in 1 minute you can say so I can...
Cooperative behavior is very common in nature. Mutualism is when two animals of any species both benefit more by doing the same thing at the same time. But beyond that, there is a kind of active cooperation. The coalition strategies that we see in Go-Go is a cooperative behavior, even if it's towards aggressive ends. And you can see cooperation that's not for aggressive ends. But among human beings, altruism, doing things beyond just cooperating for a cause, is really something that rises far above anything we see among other animals. And I think we see it in war when people are suicide bombers. That's altruism in a sense. But we also see it in culture. It's a fundamental aspect of culture. And that's what I think human beings are evolved to be, is to be a cultural species. And that involves a great deal of altruistic behavior.
Okay. Sorry, I'm going to scan around the room. Terry. So that the state of gun violence in America. Culture. I'm going to turn this over to our military expert here.
Crisis state in our country with this, and I'm just wondering where it might fit into this conversation.
Well, I mean, I'm not American, and so that's a really hard question to answer. But from where okay, there was a famous case in America 2 years ago of a psychiatrist, military psychiatrist, who carried out a massacre at Fort Hood. And this was variously blamed, first of all, on his PTSD, but then it discovered he hadn't deployed. And second, it was blamed on his radical terrorist links, which then they discovered he didn't have any. The one question that was never ever asked, because it was assumed he was a soldier, was where had he got his guns from. But in fact, he'd bought them in the gun shop. Psychiatrists don't carry guns. This is, we don't actually need it. We have drugs, so we don't need to do that kind of stuff. And it was quite remarkable. Of all the coverage, the one question, the obvious question, was where had he got his weapons from, was never ever mentioned. It's literally not mentioned in nearly all of the coverage. Now, where has that come from? I don't know. I mean, I did live in Texas, actually. I say that. I went to school there. But the remarkable, unique love affair there, and it's about concepts of liberty, it's about concepts of masculinity, and an inability to read the Constitution. I think it's those three separate issues with a view.
Not sure that's quite
I'm not sure it's in I know, but I'm not sure it's a neuroscience question, to be absolutely honest, but I'm sure it's not.
Well, but perhaps the anthropologist.
Yeah. It's not my area, and it's every time this happens, my wife says to me, "What's the matter with men?" And I say, "I don't know." It's clearly a big problem. There's a lot of different things that are involved. One aspect of it, not the explanation, but one aspect of it is that even though rates of killing in the United States on a per capita basis are lower than they were at earlier time periods, our culture is suffused with images of not just violence, but slaughter. That you see in films, not video games too, but just indiscriminate slaughter is something entertaining. We saw this most, I think, in the shooting in Colorado, when a person came in who was acting out what the Joker, what people in that audience were paying to see on the screen. And that coincidence really highlights it. But that's only part of it.
That film was shown in Britain. That's what's shown around the world.
That's right. But in that case, he was the Joker. So he was acting out a script. Doesn't mean all people do it. Okay. But part of it is that we have, why do people go and watch people getting slaughtered all the time? I mean, that's a question. Why is that entertainment? Why is slaughter entertainment?
I think that's a whole other panel. And I'm mindful that they're probably going to want to get us out of the room soon, but I do want to get a couple of questions. This gentleman right here.
Hi, I'm Jim DiMartino. I'm on the Skoll board. I just wanted to make an observation, and it's very consistent with what our two Skoll Award winners have said. I spent a day with Taddy in Cape Town. In fact, Linda and I did. And you walked away seeing a group of very disadvantaged youth brought into an environment. And if I could summarize in a sentence what I thought when I left, and it was before Taddy was awarded the Skoll Award, they learned to love themselves, they learned to love each other, and they had a pride in a community that they had joined. And if you think about that, that's a lot of what I think both of you were saying.
Daniel Rostrup, Thomson Reuters Foundation. We get social entrepreneurs around the world, free legal assistance. My question is there a role is there a role for emotional intelligence in preventing violence, and can it be taught?
Very good question. Who would like to take a shot at that first? Not you. All right. David.
I'm me. I don't know how to define emotional intelligence in this context, and whether it can be taught is an even more difficult question. I will make one point by way of evading the question and answering another question, which is that it's very important to emphasize the anti-aggressive influence that women have on men. We see this in our studies in mice, It's been observed in fruit flies. We see this at the level of fighting neurons whose activity is inhibited in the presence of females, okay? It is very unfortunate that there is only a 1-to-1 ratio of males to females on average in human society. But what we need more than anything else is for women to recognize their power to suppress aggression and violence in men, and whether that is through the teaching of emotional intelligence or through nonverbal or other methods of interaction and communication, I don't know. But you have this power, please use it.
In the world of psychiatry in general, it's true that interventions directed at the self about the control of aggression tend to be unsuccessful. And there's thousands and thousands of different ways it's been done over the years. Sometimes actually they have a completely counterproductive, as in famous studies of delinquent development. Things that work, if you look at the Cambridge delinquent study over a whole lifetime, was when the boys, and they were all boys, got to maturity, what determined whether they would continue their offending history or not was who they married, or who they had as a partner. If the partner themselves had a criminal history, they then escalated their criminal behavior. But if they didn't, they then eased off. So that's the point you were making. But it doesn't have to be that as well. The most successful interventions in the control of teenage violence and delinquency are not aimed at the child, but are aimed at the parent. So randomized trials, Steve Scott's fantastic trials, which have changed policy in the UK, of teaching consistent parenting, have had a dramatic effect on reducing subsequent violent offending behavior. So it's usually, if you look at the social environment in which the child, then teenager is. But direct interventions, such as emotional intelligence, I think the evidence is pretty well, it's pretty poor, to be honest.
Okay, I'm going to be the evil person here, and we have to stop. They're going to throw us out of the room. But first of all, I want to say thank you to the audience for participating in this experiment, the panel. But most of all, thank you to all of the individuals on the panel for spending their time and for agreeing to do this. Thank you. And I should point out that they did not know each other beforehand, and I didn't know most of them either. But just to reiterate, 11 a.m. tomorrow in the Founders Room, which was formerly Seminar Room B, all of the panel will be available from 11 a.m. You can come and ask them as many questions as you want and sort of talk with them. And again, you'll get a chance to see the pictorial output of the session behind you. Thank you.